issues in terms of managing environmental and community impacts. The scale that we're looking at deploying the energy transition in Australia over the next 10 years amplifies this by an order of magnitude greater than we've ever seen. So in order to progress that, we really need to be thinking about coordinated programs, looking at early engagement with stakeholders, and really having that meaningful community discussion and engagement to secure and win the social licence. So with that, I'll pass over to Rowan Taylor, who will introduce our speakers and host the rest of this evening. But welcome, and very pleased to have you all here today.
Well, thank you, Ilona, and thank you again to G&T for very generously supporting this event. And it's really great to have a law firm of your profile sort of getting behind such an important issue for the energy sector. Just a few quick words before we kick off the presentation proper around sort of AIE and who we are and what we do. I know that a lot of you in the audience are already members, so a lot of this stuff will you know of it already. We're a volunteer-run energy industry organisation. We do quite a few things, but the main thing that we do that we're really proud of is try and host high-quality in-person, well, increasingly in-person nowadays. It was virtual for a while over COVID to support some member networking opportunities. And we believe we provide value for our members through that process by raising awareness of energy issues, highlighting new and evolving energy technologies, and promoting discussion of energy policies. We also, aside from that, offer a range of scholarships and awards to support our members and the energy industry. So for those of you who are thinking or are on the fence or are not already members, consider joining us as an individual. And we also offer corporate memberships as well. Just a few things on housekeeping. Thankfully, I don't have to worry about Teams or Zoom tonight, so I'm not asking people to stay on mute, but I am asking you to try and switch your phones to silent. We will have a Q&A panel after each of our speakers gives their initial presentation. We've got roving microphones, so just raise your hand and we will come across to you and we'll endeavour to answer as many questions as possible. So, social licence. I think if I asked every person in this room what you think it means, I might get a different answer. It's a term that started appearing probably in the late noughties, initially around sort of coal and coal seam gas. And sort of around that time you saw, I guess, a lot of community focus groups propping up, groups like Lock the Gate, which a lot of you sort of might recognise. And I guess around that time, a lot of the concern was, I guess, that these industries were, damaging environmentally and from a climate perspective and not purely from a social perspective. So I think in the early 10s, the focus shifted onto the wind industry. The wind industry, I think, was a little bit blindsided by the fact that they were suddenly having social licence issues that were leading to a lot of their projects being significantly delayed and often huge changes to the scope of their projects that would knock out half the turbines and really affect the returns of those projects. And they were like, well, we're the good guys, we're saving the world. Why are you coming after us? Like, we shouldn't have to do anything extra for the community because we're already doing enough. And then perhaps towards the latter end, so that was a really tough period, and a lot of wind projects were taking up to 5 years to actually get a planning approval, which is crazy. And sort of towards the back end of the decade, that emphasis shifted a little bit to large-scale solar, but they haven't had as much of a hard time of it as the wind industry did. But more recently, we've seen the focus turn to transmission projects. Probably the most recent public example is around the Western Vic transmission project. That's probably the first of these big projects, first cab off the rank. But it's a relative baby at only 200 kilometres compared with what's about to come, with the ISP forecasting 10,000 kilometres of new transmission lines, with 4,000 kilometres alone in New South Wales. And the situation with transmission is actually complicated by a regulatory system that doesn't explicitly recognise expenditure on things to keep your community happy or promote social licence as efficient. So one thing's for sure, we're going to need an awful lot more of many of those types of infrastructure I just spoke about. And if we don't have social license, then the transition is just going to be longer, harder, and more costly for probably everyone. So it's my great pleasure to introduce a few of speakers who are at the forefront of this issue. And the first of those that we'll hear from tonight is Kate Healy. She's a policy manager for Realliance. She's an independent not-for-profit advocacy organisation working to secure an energy transformation delivers long-term benefits and prosperity to regional Australia. It's certainly an organisation whose profile has really risen in the last few years. Kate has worked in senior policy roles for New South Wales Government, Australian Government, Energy Networks Australia and Realliance since 2002. She has over a decade's experience working in climate and energy policy. In 2021, she authored an influential report, Building Trust for Transmission, which she's waving about right now, earning the social licence needed to plug in Australia's renewable energy zones. Kate's role at Realliance initially focused on transmission, but now includes wider energy policy leadership. She is based in Mudgee in the Central West. And Kate, would you like to? Kate's got a few slides that she's going to talk to. Just give her a chance to get set up. Just get rid of that one.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Yep. Kate Healy from Realliance, Policy Manager, as I said. I'm going to talk to you today about transmission lines particularly and the effects that some of the new developments that are being proposed can have on regional communities and what we can do to grow a positive social licence for those regional communities. Before we go ahead, I'll also acknowledge country. We're meeting today on the country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of these lands. And I and Realliance recognise their ongoing connection to land, water and community, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I don't know if you all know who Realliance is. We're quite a small organisation. We've only got 6 or 7 staff. We're an independent not-for-profit working to secure an energy transformation that delivers long-term benefits and prosperity to regional Australia, as Rowan was just saying. We work with regional communities and we sit between the industry, the renewable energy industry, government and regional communities. We spend a lot of time out with local communities, listening to what their concerns are, and we feed those concerns back to industry and government. We're partially funded by the renewable energy industry. We have wind and solar supporters, financial supporters, and we also have some backing from philanthropic organisations such as Sunrise. We advocate to the renewable energy industry and government for renewable energy development practice that includes benefits for local communities. Now, as you'll all be aware, I would imagine in this pretty expert audience, AEMO's most recent 2022 Integrated System Plan foreshadowed at least 10,000 kilometres of new transmission lines under the step change scenario. What sort of is buried in a little graph on one page is that it could be up to 28,000 kilometres if the hydrogen superpower scenario was to eventuate, and that is really a huge amount of new transmission built, and this would all be required by 2050. So why is this an issue? Local communities have already started to speak up about new transmission lines in their area. Some of these little pictures on the left-hand side here are the Merriwa-Cassilis Alliance. They're up in the Mudgee, Dunedoo, Golgong area around New South Wales where I am based. They were opposed to the new Central West Orana transmission line. AusNet's Western Renewables link is the bottom one, where the farmers took their tractors to Victorian Parliament, I think on a few occasions now, and blockaded the Parliament. So, Lee will be talking to us about HumeLink in a minute, and I'll talk a bit further about that as well. That's also a contentious project here in New South Wales. it's essential that communities are actively involved in the planning for transmission processes. So what are the nature of the concerns we're hearing? We hear from landholders that payments aren't transparent, the negotiations with transmission companies aren't necessarily on an uneven playing field. The money that's offered for transmission infrastructure hosting isn't comparable to that's available, particularly for wind farms. And it's also not on an ongoing basis. It's a one-off payment as a compensation payment, usually under compulsory acquisition powers, unless it's a negotiated settlement. But in any case, it's usually a one-off payment of a lower magnitude than what is coming regularly through the solar and wind industries. Impacts on agricultural practices aren't always clear. Western Vic people are very concerned about their effects on their potato crops, for instance, and irrigation, people are concerned about biosecurity. There can often lead to conflict between potential hosts, and people think that their time spent in putting in consultation processes isn't valued potentially. With neighbours, there's often no compensation and very little consultation if the line doesn't actually run through their property, despite the fact that people are visually impacted. There can be very little consultation and no compensation. So that's an area that there's a lot of concern out in the community about. And we also see a lack of broader government narrative. It was fantastic to see Anastasia Palaszczuk the other day stand up and launch the Queensland Energy Plan, and to give that precedence and importance from the very Premier of the state. And Matt Keane's been doing a good job here in New South Wales, but I haven't seen it sort of echoed by Dominic Perrottet or Gladys before him. And there hasn't been, enough visits to the regions, enough. It would be great to see a publicity campaign explaining to the community why there is a need for this new transmission infrastructure, why we can't just have solar panels on individuals' roofs, that there is a need for new large-scale transmission to support the new large-scale renewable development that is going on. So we see a need for better communication from government and industry to the community. Another example, as I was just saying, HumeLink is the transmission line that will link Snowy 2.0 with the rest of the New South Wales Southern transmission link. Rod Stowe did a report, the landholder advocate for Transgrid, formerly the Fair Trading Commissioner for New South Wales. You've probably seen this report. It was highly critical of Transgrid. Since then, Transgrid have done an implementation of the landholder advocate's recommendations and report. They've made significant changes to the way they're consulting with communities, or so they say. We'll hear from Lee in a minute whether he agrees with that assessment. But I think that, undeniably, they've employed new staff. They've started to engage using an IAP2 platform, they're certainly making some big efforts. They also did an undergrounding study, which was released a few weeks ago publicly, 3 times the cost, so unlikely to go ahead under the current regulatory framework. So we'll probably have discussion with Lee about that, because he's a local landholder in the area later on this evening. What is RE Alliance doing about this? Well, in July last year, I released this report, which some of you may have seen. It was reasonably influential in the right circles. Didn't hit the bestseller list, shall we say, but it advocated that transmission companies should consult earlier and deeper with affected communities, that there should be fairer and more transparent payments for landholders, that there should also be neighbour benefit payments and community benefit sharing. And that was basically built on what we've seen. RE Alliance grew out of Australian Wind Alliance, and we had seen the social licence issues that the wind industry that had previously, that Rowan was referring to a minute ago, in the 10 years ago. And over 10 years, as the wind industry matured, they've become much better at consulting with communities, talking to people, and also offering a range of community benefits. And that is usually quite standard now, that there'll be payments to the landholder, obviously, the lessee of the property, but there'll often be neighbour payments, which reduce on a sort of diameter version as you go further away from the affected wind turbines, and community benefit payments that might, be useful for building or maintaining local infrastructure, roads, halls, town halls, various infrastructure, and sometimes renewable energy infrastructure for affected neighbours, like solar panels, etc. All sorts of different things. So we'd like to see some of that same sort of model, which has really increased and improved the social licence in the wind industry, moved across to the transmission industry. Of course, that isn't easy, and it wasn't straight away clear to me. I've worked for the New South Wales government in energy policy and also for the Commonwealth at DNA, and as soon as I sort of started thinking about this, I was concerned that there might be troubles with the National Electricity Rules and the NEO, and what is efficient investment. So we made some recommendations about finding out from the AMC whether a rule change would in fact be required or not, or whether it will be permissible under the NER, as the National Electricity Rules as they stand. And we had quite a number of meetings, and you will have seen the evolution of the AMC's thinking on this over the last 12 months. The first part of the Transmission Planning and Investment Review report hardly mentioned social licence. Second one, it was one of the key issues, and it's still an important issue as we go through the sort of stage 3 report, that working on efficiency at the moment. The stage 2 report did clarify that transmission companies can pay compensation payments in addition as part of the RIT2 process. So that was very welcome to transmission companies to have that clarified by the AMC and the AER. We've had conversations with the AER, with Jim Cox, and he's keen to do that. We've also been working quite closely with the New South Wales government, and for quite a while now they've been saying that they're about to release a new benefit sharing arrangement. We're hoping it'll be soon. We've heard that it was sort of imminent from about December last year, and it's, what are we up to? September, October. Yeah, so it's been coming for a while. But the view is that what's available under the Just Terms Compensation Act isn't appropriate, but that we don't want to open up Pandora's box with every other infrastructure type, gas pipelines, roads, other telecommunications infrastructure. We need to target the increased benefit parent sharing arrangement. So that's been a complicated process, and I understand that there will be a new benefit sharing payment coming fairly soon, but we've heard that for a while. But I do have trust that the Minister sees this as an important issue, because he hears regularly from the community on this. So yeah, it's something we've been working with regulators and with the New South Wales government. And the New South Wales government is also leading work with the Victorian government through a working group, at the national level. So we're hoping that any reforms that do eventuate in New South Wales might flow out into the rest of the jurisdictions. So just going on with another case study, it is the Central West Arana Res. Transgrid originally was doing this work as the transmission, company in the state, the transmission planner and the transmission developer. New South Wales Government wasn't happy last year with their performance on social licence and community consultation, and effectively removed Transgrid from the process and has retendered the process out. Energy Co's taking over the work as far as doing the EIS and the planning for the work. We work in the Central West Arana region. I'm based there, and we have a few other staff there as well. We've done some workshops in the area, and we're seeing some potential issues. There's skill shortages in both skilled and unskilled labour in the area. There's an acute housing shortage as well, and both rental properties and properties available for sale. And having hundreds of, like, we're looking at sort of around 15 or more projects coming online with, you know, solar and wind projects, and hundreds of new staff to build those projects, and really only 1% vacancy in rental stock in Dubbo, you know, Mudgee, Dunedoo, less than that. So we're talking about only a few hundred properties available for hundreds of new staff. So I see that as a potential problem. There's flow-on issues with like other services such as sewage services, which are already at capacity. However, we're encouraged to see that progress is being made with the New South Wales Government recently establishing a Central West Arana Res Community Reference Group. There's some work underway on cumulative impacts on people who are really being acutely affected by the nature of the res. They're having the concentration of projects all in one place and all affecting a certainly small group of people. And there's increased liaison between Energy Co and the renewable energy generation proponents. I think this is my last slide because I need to close out. But our work at the moment is focusing on two main areas. We're working with the Energy Charter, and KPMG is doing some contracted work for Energy Charter on the social licence research into coexistence of energy transmission infrastructure with agricultural operations, and we're expecting to release a report probably January, February next year on that. At the moment, we're doing landholder surveys. KPMG is undertaking them for the group, and the group is composed of both transmission companies and farming groups and peak farmers. And so we're hearing from the farming community, what their issues are, and then the idea is to release a report which addresses some of the issues, you know, so that some of them can be laid to rest and best practice can be implemented in terms of, say, biosecurity, fire management, whatever the different issues that the community raises. We're also working, particularly up in the Queensland area, on renewables transmission and renewable energy generation projects. There's been significant bad press about the Caban project up in North Queensland and some of the other projects up there around significant land clearing for wind projects. So as part of that, we've been working with 30 environment and climate groups to make some recommendations to the federal government on how they can implement the 20 billion Rewiring the Nation package in a way that is sustainable. So I've left copies at the back of the room if anyone would like a copy. We released this only a week or so ago. It was in Renew Economy. Yeah, it's got some recommendations, you know, sort of both about the governance arrangements for the Rewiring the Nation funding and reforming the RIT-T, things like that, but also First Nations concerns, biodiversity concerns, offsetting concerns, things like that. So, yeah, we're continuing to work with various governments. We're working with the Queensland Government on the QRES design process. We were really impressed to see the Victorian Government's work on VTIF, the Victorian Transmission Investment Framework, which they put out maybe a month or 6 weeks ago. Very interesting work there that we're encouraged to see, keep working with the AMC on the transmission planning and investment review. Or put a submission into the latest part of that, and indeed the federal government on rewiring the nation. So I'll leave it there, but I'll be back to answer any questions and I'll have an open discussion later on.
Thanks a lot for that, Kate. Obviously an exceptionally busy time at Realliance. As Kate mentioned, we'll leave questions to the end and we'll bring everyone up in front panel style so you can get ready to grill them and all the rest of it. Next speaker is Lee Kingma. He is the owner-manager of a Tumut sheep and cattle property and a project resourcing company called Winnelli Proprietary Limited. He's a chemical engineer and he's been involved in minerals, heavy manufacturing, power generation and environmental remediation projects. He has a 900 hectare property currently hosting 2 existing 330 kV lines and was on a proposed 500 kV easement for HumeLink. And he's been advocating for lower impact solutions, better landowner engagement and fairer compensation for HumeLink and other major transmission projects. So Lee, come along. You've got slides. Yeah.
Right. What's that? Sorry. No, sorry. No. That's it. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for the introduction and enjoyed your presentation, Kate. Yeah. So as we already mentioned, I'm a landowner in the Tumut area. Where, as we said, we've got about 900 hectares. We've got, I think, 6 kilometres of 300 kV lines at the moment. 2 of them are in parallel. And I guess I thought what would be interesting to people here is what my experience was as a landowner and what I suppose what it feels like and what the community's views are. So I've got a couple of images here. The first one is a letter we got from Transgrid explaining that we would be on the corridor. And then the next one is the front page of the paper about the next day after we got the phone call, and that's actually a picture of our property, our back paddocks. And it was put to us both in the letter and on the front page of the paper, which obviously is not the responsibility of Transgrid, but that it was in response to community feedback. So I guess that was something that, you know, we didn't take that well because, you know, we obviously feel like we're part of the community as well. But for the previous 12 months, people in other areas have been advocating for it to go in different places, including over Mount Blowering, which is actually part of our freehold country there, which is that forested area there. And then the other thing which we learned, you know, after not too long was that there'd been a lot of advocacy and very effective advocacy with, you know, all different levels of government, so state, federal, our local MP, the council had got involved about trying to divert around the airport for reasons which were probably not, or arguably not legitimate, or were on the edge of being, you know, necessary to move it around the airport. And that's just one example. I got in touch with, you know, I basically followed the same playbook that the previous people had done, and I said, all right, well, I'm going to get in touch with every politician or anyone that I could think of, you know, and by the same process, because we didn't want it either. And the very strong message that we got from the existing community groups was that, you know, they're coming, they should go through the park, which means the Kosciuszko National Park. They're going to give you cents on the dollar for what it's worth. They're disorganised, they don't know what they're doing. So that, and, you know, the community sort of advocacy or community resistance group was better organised than Transgrid. Like, they had a town hall meeting, I went there, and it was shocking actually. I went there were probably 200 people there at a town hall out at Lack. There was a fellow there giving, you know, I'm sure it wasn't as polished a presentation as, you know, what we're seeing here hopefully tonight, but it really spoke to the people, and he said, you know, we're going to have a class action, don't talk to them, lock the gate. You know, we're going to get $1 million a kilometre. or they can go through the park. There's already power lines up there, you know, because from a landowner's point of view, like the park, or the Kosciuszko National Park, it's probably viewed a bit differently. You know, it's a place where the blackberries are growing, and it's a bit of a wasteland. They've already got snowy hydro. They've already got these power lines. You know, we don't need it. We don't want it. So that was the sort of thing. I suppose that was my introduction, you know, to HumeLink. It had been going on for probably 12 months. I hadn't really, at that time, I didn't read the local paper, so I didn't know much about it, but I've since started because you never know what's around the corner. Yeah, so that was sort of my introduction. And then this is just, you know, I don't really know who's in the room, what the background is, but this is what HumeLink is, I suppose, from my perspective. It's 3 circuits, or the 3 lines. This is what it essentially was at the start, and around the time that I was first introduced to it, it was 3 power lines connecting Moraga, which is a Snowy 2.0 substation. That's the output for the 2,000 or 2,500 megawatt Snowy 2.0 station. And then, you know, connecting or making a new backbone for the connection between Melbourne and, up the east coast, I guess. And I would say that the average landowner at the time, or even the more informed ones who'd been involved in it for 12 months, they couldn't tell you, or didn't understand, or maybe they just weren't listening, but they didn't really know what it was about. They thought it was for Snow 2.0 connection. That's obviously why it was coming into our area, but they didn't understand the backbone point of view, or the interconnection between the states and out to South Australia. They thought they said, well, why don't you just put a double circuit line from Snow 2.0, run it straight alongside the existing ones out Long Plain, which is what we would call open country up in the national park. Why are you even talking to us? Why don't you go and do that? And then the other thing there, which is, so the reason that the other landowners were, you know, interested in double circuit was obviously from our point of view, single circuit, double circuit, the tower is pretty much the same. You know, it's a bit higher, but actually I think the easement's a little bit narrower with the double circuit tower, or about the same. So, you know, if you go double circuit, you're going to halve the impact, half the number of landowners. And, you know, they took, and I had the same point of view. I said, well, we shouldn't be running single circuits in our area. Especially when we're paralleling existing 330 kV circuits, because the whole point of separating the circuits was to mitigate the risk. But then, you know, one of the things I picked up on pretty quickly was, well, you're building these 2 lines and you're paralleling 2 existing lines on my property where there's already been a tower collapse. And the lines come from the same place. They're not as big, but they're not that far off. So to me, it didn't make sense. And then this one, there's a couple of things here. So in the bottom there, I've got, you know, if you Google social license, and that's what comes up, they talk about legitimacy, credibility, and trust. And then what I wanted to do is sort of try and have people imagine, you know, if you look at that map, each, you know, we've got 2,500 acres, and our property is just on the bend here. It's just a dot here. So there's a lot of smaller landowners there. So every one of those lines is hundreds of people. And every one of those lines have got a letter saying that there's going to be a transmission line, and none of them want it. And, you know, they're all upset about it. So that's one thing. I think that it's probably easy for people to draw a line on a map without having that perspective. And then another thing I wanted to sort of point out was that red line is roughly what's going to get built. And that's all that the people on that line need to know about HumeLink. But all those other lines, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 lines there that didn't really need to be involved. They didn't need to go through that period of, you know, wondering why it's coming here, stressing about it, you know, I suppose staying up late at night writing letters to people, anyone who will listen, and a lot of people who won't. and so, yeah, I wanted to make that point that I think the consultation obviously is important, but when we talk about consultation, I think there's maybe a perception or an idea that if we consult with the communities, explain why we need the power lines, then they might, they're going to accept it. But actually, the more you find out about it, the less you want it, really. So it's not really, within reason, it's not always helpful. And like I know, from my experience, I've already got 2 of them. And day to day, I suppose it's not a big deal, but that you're going to have people coming in, they're going to be cutting trees down, mulching, wherever they need to go. Mulching means, huge machinery with big drums that just chew up any vegetation that is there. They're using your tracks. We've had a 330 kV power line collapse, electrified the fences, phone line, it's a big deal. And then, a long time later, there's just timber poles holding up this existing line. And, and the other thing with the people who've got the existing lines is that, they were put in the 70s or 80s when my father-in-law was there or when his father was there. And they got, again, very minimal compensation. So anyone who's already got a line is sort of going, well, okay, I know what it's like. I don't want another one. And I want to make up what my father didn't get. And he spent the last 40 years complaining about. So, all right, now we've got another shot. Let's try and at least get some money out of it. That's sort of the reality. So, I mean, that's one of the things, like people talk about minimising the impact by paralleling existing corridors, but, someone who's already got a couple and in an area that's sort of, the terrain's quite constrained where, you don't have a lot of open or flat areas. So to really just keep easement after easement after easement on those properties, the cumulative impact can be higher, can be arguably worse than a greenfield site. And again, like when I talk about why that route didn't make sense to me, if you go back to the earlier versions of the ISP, there was a whole chapter on bushfire resilience, and they specifically said that all these upgrades are not going to parallel existing lines because we don't want to have the situation we had in 2019, 2020 when we almost blacked out the state. But then a few months later, forget about that. It's not in the latest ISP. There's nothing there about bushfire resilience. And even the Transgrid, the TAPR, I think it's called, their guidelines talk about avoiding, or maybe not completely, but, managing that risk. And then yet when, at one stage they were going to parallel that. And obviously it's a difficult job, and I wouldn't want to have the job of moving the power lines. But I guess the point I want to make there is that if you're going to send that letter to someone and tell them the power line's coming, then you really want to have a good reason why it's going to go there. I think that's more important than this kind of broad scale consultation, in my view, because all you're doing, like I said, you put it on they've come out and said, okay, this is where we're going to go with the single circuits. You've just galvanised a whole army of people. They establish their networks with the local MP, the politicians. They come and visit, you have a meeting with them. And then they say, oh, no, actually, we are going to move it now. We're going to move it, from that orange line where it says original Yabba moved it there, moved it around the back of the airport. And then the same guys who told you that the first route was no good organised a town hall meeting. And then, so now you've got the guys from the first route and the next route and the route after that. And one stage, probably a fair percentage of that was still in play, or at least around Tumut, all 3 options were in play at the same time. So, it only makes the job harder for Transgrid or whoever it is to make progress when you've sort of alienated a lot of the town. And and I guess going back to those 3 points there, I suppose what I was trying to say is if you're a transmission company and you want to get social license, well, I suppose when I look at my experience and, this company or entity that wants social license, they want to earn credibility, trust and legitimacy, does that map, as a landowner, does that look like a company that or an organisation that knows what they're doing, and you know that it has a legitimate purpose, a legitimate selection criteria, a sort of rational plan. Can you trust them because they've told people in one corridor that it should go here, then they sent them a letter that says it's not coming there, and then they said, no, actually it is coming here now. So I think that, at least in my experience, and also actually similar in the res that Kate mentioned, where I think they had some single circuit alignments at the start, and one of the guys up there was calling me about it. And yeah, same sort of thing. They come from a position of the optimal electrical situation without considering the impacts to landowners, then just back themselves into a corner where they can't proceed, got to redraw everything, and then who knows now what the, you know, when you're a landowner, they don't understand any of the ins and outs. So all they know is that the company's backed down once before and they probably will again. And yeah, I guess this just ties in a bit to what Kate was saying. There's a couple of front pages from our local newspaper. The first one is like point I wanted to make was that you shouldn't underestimate the depth of, you know, negativity around these projects. Like there's people there, you go walk down the main street, they've gone and cut a load of firewood, put it in a truck, and then they're selling raffle tickets to raise money and awareness for their cause. You know, that's what they're doing. They've got signs, and they see it as a community cause. You know, it's something which they really feel extremely strongly about. I think it's getting better, but I personally find it, you know, I don't think it's helpful, obviously, because it only makes the project look worse in the eyes of the people who are going to get it than possibly it is. But that's where it's at. And then the other one I wanted to point out was, you know, there's been a few wind farm projects go in our area. One under construction, Jeremiah, and then there's about half a dozen that the forestry, like Forest Corp, who operate all the state forests, looking into at the moment. And I've never heard anyone really say anything negative about any of these wind farm projects. And in fact, the biggest objector to HumeLink has been arguing for 15 years that he wants a wind farm on his property, and he's just got it built. That's the Jeremiah wind farm. So yeah, I think when I heard about Kate's report from David Shoebridge, actually, you know, it definitely opened my eyes and made me think about, well, why is that? Why is it that people are looking for wind farms on their property, but they're selling, you know, having wood raffles to raise money to stop the transmission line? So, you know, I think obviously Kate articulated probably some of those reasons better than I will, but yeah, there's definitely, you know, a lot to learn there. And then, yeah, this is again just following on from, I guess, what Kate said, but this is something that I did sort of help people who are still impacted. And I guess there's a few lines of text there, but the main point is the impact of the transmission lines is pretty comparable to having a wind farm on your place. In some ways it's worse, in some ways it's probably not as bad, but the compensation just doesn't compare. Like, I got some data from a wind farm that has gone up recently, and yeah, they're getting about 500k. Like, if you take the annual payment and do the NPV calculation, work out what's worth today's money, you know, it's just 5 times or probably more. I think, no, sorry, 10 times on a tower basis. And so, and you know, landowners who've got, you know, a reasonable sized property, you know, from time to time people will develop it and they'll build tourist accommodation, or they'll go looking for a wind farm, or subdivide it, you know. And there's a lot of emerging land uses around carbon capture, biodiversity offset sites, and the compensation act, or at least the interpretation of it by the network providers, doesn't consider all those alternative uses. And it's very difficult for the individual landowner to go and argue that, oh, well, I could have put a biodiversity offset site in and it's worth 10 times what you're saying it's worth. But that's the situation that they're faced with, and it's really an uneven playing field, and it's very, there's no transparency either. And then the reason I put the graph in there, I just wanted to show that if we look at the cost of land, and in particular compensating private landowners, which is probably only, say, 100 million roughly of that blue slice of the pie, it's a small part of the project cost. It's not, even if you double that and it goes from 100 to 200, it's not going to materially change the cost to power consumers. And the other thing obviously that jumps out is that apparently we're, prepared to pay $930 million in bio offsets, which, it's probably questionable what value that money, what that's actually going to achieve, because, I think it's pretty well known for what the bio offset scheme is supposed to do is if you clear 100 hectares of habitat, someone somewhere else is going to lock up 100 hectares and preserve it. But that's, it's pretty debatable whether that's actually going to happen. But the real question is, are we happy to spend 10 times more on this offset scheme than we are on compensating landowners? So I think that's my last slide. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Lee. Fascinating perspectives there. We routinely hear from sort of corporate, developers, regulators. So it's really refreshing to get a landowner perspective for a change. So thank you. So our last speaker is Tim Edwards. He is the Managing Director of Cutler Mertz. It's a specialist management, engineering and economic consultancy for the power and energy sector. He's worked on several large and complex energy infrastructure projects and has developed engagement aspects across all phases, including definition planning, design, procurement and construction. He's paid particular attention to addressing key concerns and issues raised which impact social licence, and he's done so by engaging directly with the community and key government, regulatory and industry bodies. So take it away, Tim.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. There was quite a bit of transgrid bashing in the previous. I would note, but I guess I know that I'm in the way of some interesting discussions, questions from the floor, conversations, and I really don't want to hold that back. And I don't have a deck, but I spotted a whiteboard and I couldn't help myself, so I did ask for the pen, and I will put one picture up that I think, in my view, and in hopefully leading into the conversations and the questions from the floor, captures the essence of the issues that we're trying to deal with respect to social license. And so from that perspective, and our mission over at Cutler Mertz is really to try to, through independence, create that balanced view. Not to say that what Kate and what Lee have put up, we've engaged in several conversations, particularly myself and Lee, over several months, if not years, that at the end of the day, every view is extremely valid, but everything is around context, and getting the context right when we're having the discussion ends up, by and large, creating the elements that Lee had on the presentation that translate into social license. So here's my crack at 3 circles that I think carry out or hold within them the secret to what will allow the winners in the social license game to prevail. And for those who don't heed the 3 circles, in my humble opinion, they don't stand a chance, and they stand to be caught up in a lot of the issues that Lee and Kate have put forward. So here goes. All right. Gilbert and Tobin really need to invest in their whiteboard markers. I'll leave that for them to consider. I guess what I've got up here is really a view around policy positions that then translate into acts, laws, regulations. And what seems to me at this point in time to really be exacerbating the social license problem is we do have regulators for each of time, cost, and people and places. If we use New South Wales as an example, the time element is very heavily tied to what Kate showed on the screen with respect to the ISP. AEMO is a regulator. It's a regulator of time by which large-scale transmission infrastructure needs to be in place. The AER is another regulator that regulates the national electricity rules with a specific focus, given it's a branch of the ACCC, on cost and keeping the cost as minimal as possible to energy consumers. DPE, going from, I guess, federal regulators to New South Wales or state-based regulators, the Department of Planning and Environment, won't pass an EIS or an environmental impact statement submission from the transmission proponent unless people and places are appropriately considered. So in my humble view, and to kick off the discussion, I think the transmission proponent that seeks to maximize the overlap between these three circles is the one that's going to crack the nut on social license, because what it does mean is equal weighting is placed on the elements of having the 10,000 plus kilometres of transmission lines in place, keeping the energy consumer happy from a cost perspective in terms of how much the electricity will cost, and keeping the departments that are going to pass your EISs happy and in check, because all of the issues that have been brought up from a people and places perspective are duly considered, inclusive of alternatives. So I can talk about this stuff for ages, but I guess I really wanted to put this picture on the board because I think there's a lot of truth in what Lee and Kate have shared with us so far, but with the additional context of the pressures that are happening through the regulators and their representatives in pushing almost in opposite directions, I think social license will be achieved if we actually focus on maximizing this red bit. But thanks, Rowan, for introducing me, and looking forward to the chat and the debate up front.
Thank you, Tim. So we'll throw to the audience now, but just give us a little bit of time to get some chairs set up. I think we'll probably set them up just in front of the screen. So one moment. Would you like to stand, please? Yeah, one of you.
Lee, you're not off the hook yet.
There's a young man up the back with his hand raised.
I guess, are a greater social licence. I just want to be clear, you know, about the easements as well. If it goes underground, you effectively, as the landowner, get the land fully back again. And I perceive the benefit would be that we just get the transmission built more quickly. You know, I think we all understand we can't decarbonise, you know, unless we just like putting stuff on people's roofs. We've got to have wind and solar farms and transmission. So we have to have it. We have to have it quickly.
Yeah, so the undergrounding study is available on Transgrid's Hume. The undergrounding study is available on Transgrid's Hume webpage if you want to have a look at it. It's it looks at various different options like routes and looks at the costs, AC, DC and DC. You know what I mean? AC, DC, HVDC, H versus HVAC. Sorry, I'm getting a bit tangled up there, but you know what I mean. Yes, so HVDC lines being a different technology, the HVAC ones being the alternating current ones, which are more common. The HVDC ones are less expensive, but they have the big transformer, like stations that they need to build every a number of kilometres along the line, which adds to the cost very significantly. So I guess, does it look at the terms of reference for the report asks the consultant to look at both the cost aspects, which they knew would be higher. They knew in advance, not the exact quantum of how much higher they would be, but to also look at the benefits to communities of undergrounding. There is some feedback which the local community has made, I think, on the Transgrid's web page, isn't it? It would take longer. It would take, like, it's between 5 and 7 years if it's going to be underground, whereas it would be 3 to 4 years if it was overground. So it would, and that's quite a important aspect with Liddell closing down. So we do need to get this transmission built quite quickly with major generation sources coming off, in the next little while. So it would take longer, and it would be very $10.5 to $11 billion versus $3.3 billion.
My follow-up question on that, just very quickly, is on the benefit side as well. If you pay the landowners more, that's allowed under the rules, but how will the AER assess the benefit side of that?
We've had chats to the AER, and their assessment is that if it's a matter of determining what efficient costs are in their way of thinking, and their view is that if a project that's vital for the ISP, which is an actionable ISP project, which is going to contribute to national energy security of the NEM, is going to be significantly delayed, or even stopped. The alternative view of increasing landholder payments, as Lee said, quite small in the scheme of things compared to even the biodiversity offsets, would be seen as an efficient cost. Now, we had a chat to Jim Cox recently, and I asked him whether he's the deputy chair of the AER, asked him whether he'd be interested in developing a guideline or something like that to provide some guidance to industry on what efficient costs are. And he's just said he'd probably prefer to take it as a case-by-case basis as each transmission project comes up at the moment. With Project Energy Connect, they've already paid above market costs for landholder payments. So Transgrid put in some special requests there, and the AIR wound them back in their contingent project assessment process, but they still did allow some extra costs. So their view is that they'll look at the AMC has given the go-ahead through the Transmission Planning Investment Review Stage 2 report to say, transmission companies, come to us. It's okay to include social licence costs in the RIT-T process, and we'll assess them and see on a case-by-case basis whether they're efficient costs.
I don't know if I can just follow that up a little bit on the undergrounding report. That was, and Tim knows more about it than I do, but or as much. But it was driven by the community. The number one question from the community is, why can't you just put it underground? You know, they say things like, you know, that's what they're doing in Dorset. In the UK, they're pulling down the old HV lines and burying them to improve the view. So why are we still building overhead power lines? And so I think that report probably should be viewed in that context. It was really because the question keeps coming up, and there wasn't a direct answer. There was, it costs 10 times more, but you know, people argue about that, and I think that report was intended to answer that question. I don't think it was intended, you know, to be the basis for moving to an underground solution. And then on the Energy Connect compensation, I probably know less about it than Kate, but what I have seen from the publicly available information, even though it's redacted, is quite obvious. There's an obvious trend of people getting paid more the more they hold out and the better the negotiators they are. So it's not as though, you know, Transgrid said, and this is not, I'm not having another go at Transgrid, but it's not as though Transgrid went to the AR and said, oh, we need to give these guys 20% more. They said, oh, look, 50% have signed up for 100% of their entitlement, and, you know, 25% have signed up for 120%. We've still got these guys hanging out. We need a bit more money. This is just my interpretation, but I think that's probably broadly correct. And I think that's one of the big problems is that there's not, like what's happening in Tumut at the moment is people are getting their letters, which have an independent valuation, and some of them are signing it, some of them aren't, you know, and some of them are probably negotiating and saying that, oh, there's a house site there and the value has missed that, so there's another 100 grand, you know, but the people who can't do that are just signing on the line and taking what they get. And I think that's one of the things which is fundamentally unfair at the moment.
I came along to learn this evening, so I don't know a lot about the subject, but I've got your two bestsellers, Kate. I'll read them and come back to you with questions. But I've done a lot of work in your area of Mudgee in representing farmers in getting fair and reasonable compensation for their farms based on metalliferous resources under the ground and coal resources under the ground. That's pretty easy if you're a competent person to define a value for what that farm is worth. And I was appalled that the majority of farmers, and I agree with what Lee said, they just signed on the line for what the value, if they were selling their farm as farms, with a little bit of a premium. So I'd recommend that farmers get together and do something a little bit smarter than just sign on the dotted line. And I thought Lee's last slide was valuable in terms of trying to define what's a fair and reasonable value, because he went through each of the elements and looked at the two columns. So I thought that was excellent. I was a bit underwhelmed that Tim couldn't produce one slide. He had to do it up on the whiteboard, which I can't read up here. I got my glasses. I've had experience with the New South Wales government on underground stations for the light rail, and I might as well whistle in the dark to
some attention. So I'm just told it's a New South Wales government, I forget the terminology, project, and it's not negotiable. Like it or not. So good luck to the farmers in the Tumut area and the Mudgee area.
Tim, up the front.
Yeah, Tim from ACCO. Just probably 10 years ago, the whole journey with neighbouring property compensation has been an interesting one. And I think 10 years ago, it felt kind of like an abhorrent precedent to compensate neighbours to a wind farm, say, just because, you know, the noise limits might be below what the thresholds need to be. But if they're going to see them and they still might occasionally hear them, that they might get some compensation. You mentioned that even for transmission lines now, there's models being set up where neighbouring properties to the owners of the properties who actually have the infrastructure are getting some payments. Can you give us a little bit more of an insight as to what that model might look like as you move away from the infrastructure?
Well, that's what we advocate for in our report. It's not in place in any jurisdiction in Australia yet. I'm holding my breath for this New South Wales government to put out their, benefit sharing arrangements. I heard that it was going ahead across the desk of the head of Energy Code 2 weeks ago, and it was all ready to fly. And I think all the, Queensland Energy Plan and Victorian energy storage target and everything, I probably thought they'll wait for some clear air, so maybe we'll get something soon out of them. But I'm not subject, I'm not working in government these days. I just work, I knock on the government's door and ask them, what's going on. And they tell me it's still in confidence. So we hope that the package they put out will be a package for benefit sharing for additional payments for landholders who host transmission on their properties. Ideally, that would also include some sort of payment for neighbours to a lower degree, obviously, because they're not as affected. And we advocate for, Reliance advocates for like some community benefit sharing projects as well. Ideally, with the reses that are being developed, you could have some region-wide projects where pooled funding could be used from some of the generation projects and the transmission projects to really deliver some substantial projects that benefit the local communities. And that's what we've advocated for, but it's not practice in any jurisdiction in New South Wales is the most advanced, and they haven't yet announced their package. So watch this space.
I don't understand why, listening to Lee, why Transgrid doesn't gold-plate it, to use the old term. I mean, I don't mean gold-plate it, but it's in the transmission company's interest to have as big a regulated asset base as possible. Why aren't they actually getting behind all the landowners, Tim, can I ask, and actually, saying to the AIE, look, we'd like to double this payments to them because we can get the whole thing done a lot more quickly and efficiently that way.
Go ahead. I think Kate wants to start.
I'll give it to Lee in a second, but Transgrid is, and all of the transmission companies, like we work with Powerlink and Transgrid and AusNet and Tas Networks, particularly all down the East Coast. And the transmission companies are all in favour of increasing payments to landholders because it will make their business easier. Well, it depends on the way you set it up under the RIT-T, but if it's part of the, potentially, yes. That's quite possibly true. But that's not the main reason they're wanting to do it. The main reason they want to do it is because they're having significant social licence issues, and they see that, paying a decent amount to landholders is likely to increase the likelihood of getting their projects up in a timely way. So that's the main reason they're in support of it.
Yeah, I was going to pass it to Tim, but I just can't help jumping in. So I think, you know, if you're a transmission company and you want a gold plate, you don't go for the 10%, because if you increase that by 50%, you've got, so you go and you try and build 2 single circuits, or you try and build a transmission line that, you know, that's the, so, but anyway, that's what I would do if I was, I suppose, if I was in that business. But but Transgrid have definitely, we've had exactly the same discussion where, you know, we want to be on the, you know, we're on the same side of the table, so we felt like they should be pushing harder, and I think they probably already were, but they've definitely been more visible, I think, and trying harder. That's my impression, but I should let Tim get the microphone.
I guess it's a great question, and apologies about the slide again, but I think it's the cost side of things and the extent to which a transmission proponent is, to your point, a very highly regulated entity. So it becomes about the Just Terms Act, and it becomes about the extent to which regulator, when they're regulating on cost, are considering the underlying legislation and the extent to which there is a delta that's not in favor of energy consumers. And so that doesn't take the transmission proponent off the hook. I think to Lee's point, and I think to Kate's presentation around the Rod Stowe report and the extent to which there was a response to engagement, the idea here is the transmission proponent is the closest to the community when they're developing that project, and they need to carry that voice through in a way that Lee has just mentioned has become more visible in recent times in the Transgrid example. And that's where the obligation almost stops, because the extent to which they may advocate add another layer, irrespective of the cynicism of how the asset base may grow, the level of regulation on transmission proponents does not allow them to actually go beyond acts and regulations that are preset. So are transmission proponents obliged to carry the voice of community through if community feels like their land is worth more? Absolutely. Can they then take a position on that? They're guided by the regs, so that's where they stop short.
I have one additional question. The Repowering Australia fund is going to put a lot of money into transmission. That is stated purpose, even though everyone wants the money, of course. Do you see some of that money will somehow be used to speed up the whole thing and essentially go through some of this legislation?
Yeah, it's really hard to speculate. I think to what you've insinuated, everyone wants a piece of that action. And so exactly how it'll be directed is unclear, but it was very clear in the lead up to the Albanese government being in place and Bowen's position on social license stopping projects dead, that there is an intention with the new federal government to actually look at social license differently and consider it. Exactly how that translates into dollars and cents is yeah, it's probably a bit too early to tell. But to Kate's point, I think this sense of the benefit sharing and land compensation in particular, I understand is going to be a core element of the imminent announcement. It's about jurisdictions moving in response to what they're hearing. And my point is proponents are not off the hook. They need to be active and they need to carry that voice. But then the extent to which Lee had an interesting picture there with the wind farms being welcome and the transmission lines not being welcome. Lee and I have had this debate before, so I can repeat it. But a market player in a competitive market, being the wholesale energy market, can calculate a prospective profit, can take off it a cost, and that cost is variable. And the extent to which a wind farm developer is unregulated in its push to develop its project will actually favor different developments and landholders with respect to payments that these developers are actually allowed to take on. So in contrast to your point around, well, why can't Transgrid push in a particular direction and try to pay the money? It's really about being on the regulation spectrum.
They push on every other. I mean, I'm 20 years of analysing regulated entities, and they can push as hard as they want it when they want to. My point is, they could push if they really wanted to. And sure, the AR might knock it back, but even Paul the Convoy, if Chris Bowen knocks on her door and says you want another turn, you can go along with this. Well, then she probably will.
I think Lee's itching to say something here.
Well, I suppose, again, just with the sort of context issue, everyone, including myself, says that the compensation is a problem. And it is a problem, but there was nothing on the letter saying how much money I was going to get. All that we all knew is that it's not going to be enough. So part of the problem is that lack of transparency. And when you're engaging with people 2 years before you're selecting a route, there's a lot of time there for the town hall meetings and for everyone to find out that they're not going to get enough money. And there's just no real indication from the proponent what that money looks like. Is based on evaluation, but who knows what the valuation is going to say. So that's part of it, I think. And yeah, I mean, I also 100% agree, like just from my understanding, you see they're always, and it's obviously not any one particular provider, but they're always out there talking about how much more expensive it is to cut down a tree or to trim a limb now than it used to be. And they talk about how much more the community expectation on bushfire prevention has increased. But like I said, I've got, there's an awful lot of trees on our place, and I haven't seen the step change in the vegetation management that sometimes they ask money for. So yeah, just agree basically. Yeah.
We've probably got time for just a couple more questions, so I might throw Heather. I believe you have one.
I do. Thank you. At risk of being stoned, I am from Transgrid, so my apologies, everybody. Kate, you mentioned in your talk about the impact to agriculture and some of the challenges of going through agricultural land. Lee, you mentioned about preference of landowners, farming landowners to go through the national parks. And Tim, you mentioned about this struggle of the three-way pushing. We've got Department of Planning and our heritage and our ecology kind of agencies really pulling us really hard back from impacting native vegetation. Question is, do any of you think that there is a place for New South Wales government to have a policy around preferencing public land use for public assets?
Well, our position, when we say public land, often we mean national parks and reserves. So it sounds nice until you realise that you're actually going to have significant biodiversity problems if you do that. So we're not necessarily in favour of that. I know the former leader of the Nationals was very big on that, like saying, yeah, let's go right through the national parks and just... You've heard Matt Keane say it too, have you? But, well, obviously the costs are going to be higher to the transmission company if they're going to go through a heavily wooded area. There's going to be higher fire risk, and there'll be bigger biodiversity offset costs and biodiversity impact costs. So I'm not a big fan myself.
Thanks. There's a couple of things there. One is that the biodiversity offset costs are actually the highest in the woodlands, so which is trees interspersed with grass, which is the kind of country that we have some of that. The bush, or what we would call bush, was heavily forested. There's still plenty of that out there. It's not actually a valuable habitat in the marketplace of biodiversity. So I think that's one thing which is kind of counterintuitive, but I agree. Public lands are normally set aside for public purposes because they have some special value to the public, whether it's as a national park or as forestry. And my main business really actually is in forestry. I have a contracting company. Our main client is Visy. They have a huge pulp mill there, and Yeah, there's probably one point I disagree with a lot of the landowners is that you know, if you put it through the forestry, well, you completely wipe out the productivity of that land, whereas on grazing land, it's a much lower impact. I think a lot of the impacts that people talk about for agriculture are really just other ways of saying that they don't want the transmission line on their place. Like we have them. They do have impacts. You can't use aerial spraying. You know, it means you've got people coming and going. They look terrible, but they don't really materially impact a grazing farm in the way that they impact forestry. But yeah, but I guess the biggest point about that really is what's missing at the moment is it's not just about public versus private land. It's about paralleling existing easements. You know, the private land use. There's no transparent or public criteria for selecting where the lines could go that you can look up and understand why it's got to go through your farm. So I think if that gap was filled, then that would maybe help some of those issues.
Probably got time for just one more question.
Sorry, Heather, I can't give you some of my wisdom on that one.
Can I make one last comment? As someone who's worked in distribution, regulated distribution, transmission, right, I do really challenge them personally to give you something. We don't. What I really need, what I really want to say is, it's about time we as a nation faced up to the myth that we can transition to renewables without additional costs relative, not ignoring the external costs of the renewable. Don't expect to match the cost of coal and gas as it used to be if we transition. It is going to cost more. And so what? Is my response. It costs more for all of us, and ideally it costs more across the world. It means that there will be change in the structural way in which we produce goods and services. My comment about easements would be that one of the reasons the AIE, I suspect, is really concerned about paying too much for this is that the whole lot of easements are already up there that we bought from Solomon. An absolute Solomon years and years ago. And yes, we're not earning much on our books for them because that's what we paid for. But hey, the easements are now 10 times more useful than the restrictions to recognise the value of those easements at their current value. But the regulator is a real, places a real constraint on what can be paid fairly to landowners. From my perspective, personally, I think you guys should be paid better, and frankly, the existing easements should be paid better. I think, finally, I want to make a comment, and I made it to my colleague here, on the matter of whether it's underground or overhead. We have Sun Cable proposing to start an underground cable all the way from Darwin to Singapore, and they expect to make a commercial return by selling to Singapore. If they can do that, then we can underground all the way across from Central Australia to the East Coast here, and not body it down in the future.
That's a good note to end on, I think. So, I don't know if we solved social license tonight, but
I don't know if the AER would agree with that.
But yeah, thank you to our panelists. A lot of fantastic insights and food for thought, and also to the audience for their great participation. I hope that most of you can stay for refreshments and just a bit of mingling and networking after this event. I want to say once again, thank you to Gilbert and Tobin for hosting. It's very, very generous and very much welcomed. And finally, if you're not already a member of AIE, I strongly encourage you to join, and if you want to come to more events of this caliber. So thanks everybody, and drinks are at the back.